All right, so Craig just left a little while ago, and we spent about 10 hours working on the plane this weekend. About 6 hours yesterday, 4 hours today. Um, the idea was to work on both of ours and kind of get a couple steps done on both. Unfortunately, he's waiting on a part. His machine's tail rib on the outboard side that was originally shipped with his kit was just manufactured not quite right. It doesn't quite line up. So until that part gets here later this week, we kind of had to work on mine. But I'll return the favor when his part gets here, and we'll go and get his caught up. But most of what we did, or I guess where we started, was trammeling yesterday, and that's squaring the wing. Before we did that, we kind of realigned the sawhorses. I've had the shims under the front feet for a while, and that's under both, just to get them level. They're also positioned to be 151 inches apart. So we just double checked all that, made sure they were still level, 151 inches apart. And if I go back around to the outboard side of the rear spar here, you'll see that there is a 1-inch block that I've placed underneath. And that's just to give 1 inch of rise of the rear spar over the 151 inches between them. And that gives the wing what's called washout angle, and it's just a little bit of a twist so that this outer part of the wing is at a lower angle of attack. That causes the inboard part of the wing to stall first when you stall, so that you get aileron control over throughout your stall. So that's kind of an important part of the wing, so we just wanted to double check that, make sure we we're getting it right. After that, we got to start trammeling. And again, trammeling is just squaring the wing, and you do that one bay at a time with these drag wires. You can see the wires create an X in between two tubes here. And, you're kind of working on one bay at a time to square. So with the drag wires, we started with each tube getting about a little over an inch sticking out the front, and then fully loosening the back nuts all the way to the back here. And that way we had plenty of play to move the spars back and forth to get them squared. This first bay, you square against the number 2 compression tube or drag tube here. And the reason you do that is because you need these hinge blocks to be square with one another. So you need this first tube to be square. And that's so that those hinge blocks can bolt onto the fuselage right up there. Sorry about the focus. And if it's not square, the bolts won't go through. So, this is the same distance as over there. Here is the same distance as there. So if these are two 90-degree angles, then these have to be two 90-degree angles. You've made a rectangle. We can't get a square in here because of that first rib. So they have you square it down here instead. So I've got a modified framing square actually hanging right there under the mini split. And you'll notice that the corner is kind of cut off, and then we cut one side to be pretty short. The reason for that, coming back over here, is because you need the short side so it'll fit right in here. If we left it full length, it would hit this rib and not be able to fit. And then we cut the corner off so it'll fit around this fitting right here. Hopefully you can see that. So have to cut the corner off. But we basically start by squaring that tube against the front and the back spar, moving it back and forth so that it's nice and square. Once it was, we just finger tighten the drag wires here and over there for the front bay. That held it pretty square. And then we went back and forth and just kind of did a little bit of tension or tightening on each one back and forth to keep the tension between both wires the same about so that it would stay square. And then, kept double checking the square against the tube. The hard part there with the square against the tube is that this tube actually bows a little bit. It's really hard to tell, but it's slightly bowed because of the tension on it. And that makes the square not sit perfectly straight against it even when everything is correct. So we just kind of had to make sure it looked the same on both sides as much as we could tell. And Craig actually brought like a laser cross line over, and we lined that up on the bottom of this spar and then on that tube, and everything looked good there. So that also kind of told us as a backup way to tell us that, yep, everything looks good. You also need a certain amount of tension on these wires. Notice the point where they cross. One of these in this first bay, this wire is thicker, and this wire is a little thinner. So from the point where they cross, you should be able to pull this thinner wire so it deflects 1/2 inch, and that should take 13 to 15 pounds of force. So you do that with a little kind of fishing or luggage scale. So you just kind of keep tightening until you get to that point. After a while of tightening, the drag wires want to spin instead of actually getting tightened. So we drew some, there's still one on here, but we drew these little Sharpie marks so we could see if it was spinning, and then used some pliers wrenches, since they don't have teeth, so but they grip tightly, so we could grip this without damaging it and hold it in place while we tightened. But got the first bay done, and then after that, the wires are holding that rigid, so you can move on and not have to worry about that bay anymore. The rest of the bays, the important thing is to get that rear spar as straight as possible, because there are these hangers, 1, 2, and 3, so these guys there, that hold the aileron. And if that rear spar they're attached to is not straight, those guys won't make a nice straight line, the aileron won't fit correctly, and even if you can get it on, it'll bind when you move it and things like that. So it has to be really straight. The key to doing that is just running a string line along this outside edge of the rear spar. So what we did was took a little block of wood and placed it on the spar just to hold the string line, maybe a 1/4 of an inch up off the top, and ran it out. It turns out the key is just to run it out to the end of the bay that you're doing next. So, here with bay 2, we ran it out just to pass this tube. And then we adjusted it so that the spacing from the edge of the spar out here to the string line was the same on both ends. We kind of just set a plastic ruler up against the spar, and it just barely didn't touch the line that we ran. And then we went all the way along and made sure that it was the same, that same distance everywhere along the whole line on this bay. That tells us, okay, we've got the string line, because it's a taut line, it forms a straight line. The spar's in line with it the whole way, so the spar is a straight line. From there, we tightened the drag wires in that bay. Again, just hand tightened to kind of set the tension or to start setting the tension and hold it square. And then just, again, back and forth one at a time, a little bit at a time, tightened until we got the correct tension and everything, double checked the square, and then moved on. Repeated that for bays 3 and 4 out there too. Took a little bit of time to kind of figure out the right process for this. A key for us, we got to read all sorts of tips online and things, and one of the tips is that the thicker drag wires have kind of fewer threads per inch, so you need to tighten them a little less than you would the thin wires to keep the tension the same. So that was a good tip. But something else, that we didn't realize was that we should only run the string line out to the end of the next bay that we're straightening, because the bays before that are all already straight, so the string line should make a straight line there, and then we should continue that straight line out with the bay that we're doing. We had it running along the whole spar, which just made life harder, because then we're trying to straighten the whole wing all at once. So we kind of figured that out. I think bay 2 or 3 is where we really started to kind of learn that lesson. And that made life way easier, just to kind of incrementally move that string line out. Once we got it straight and everything looked good in the back, we ran a string line along the front spar as well and just double checked everything. They should be the same, they're held a constant distance apart by the ribs and these compression tubes, but we just wanted to double check, and everything out there looked the same too, and it all looked good. So we were pretty confident that the wing was square at that point, but they do have you temporarily mount that center aileron hanger right there, and then mount the aileron to the hangers. And they tell you everything should line up nicely, and you should be able to slide 1/4 inch bolts in without any having to force it. This confused us a little bit, because the two ends slid in great, but that center hanger, we had to lift the hanger and the aileron both up a little bit in the middle to get it to align to slide the bolt in. But once they were aligned vertically, it slid in great. So that was a little confusing because we'd think, okay, if it weren't straight, it wouldn't align right, but it wouldn't align front to back, not top to bottom like that. Once we got the bolt in, or once we got it lined up, the bolt slipped in great, and once it was mounted, the aileron moved very smoothly. There wasn't any binding or anything like that. So it made us feel like we were probably right, but we weren't quite sure. What it turned out to be is this is just mounted with one bolt through there and has a fair bit of flex because it's only mounted in one spot right now. It'll later get kind of held through back here too. Because of the weight of the aileron sags and that sags, and there's just kind of enough sagging in the middle there that we got confirmation like, yeah, you might have to lift it up a little bit if things are sagging some. So that made us feel good about it. The other thing that we realized later today is if we take a look, and it's kind of hard to get the camera to do it, but if we try to get this lined up here, you'll hopefully be able to see that all the holes just line up really nicely. I can't get it to focus there anyway. Let's see. Oh, that was almost it. Well, you can kind of see with the blurriness in the middle. If you look through the hole from the end, all three holes line up, which is another good sign that we did that correctly. So that's as far as we got yesterday. Put the aileron back, figured it was pretty well trammeled. We had test fit the aileron, just needed to do a couple things to finish it up today. So what that was is because we set the front of the drag wires to stick out an inch, the back can kind of stick out a little bit far, like this guy here. This one, when it stuck out, got really close to the center aileron hanger. It's a little too close, so we started off by taking off the aileron hanger and trimming this guy back a little bit. Dave Embry actually trims all of them. Figured there's not really a point in trimming all of them if they're not going to interfere with anything back here. The manual doesn't call out for it, but because this one did get a little close, we trimmed that off. The extra threads here aren't doing anything anyway. There's another one right here where you can see a tail rib is going to attach in these holes. And this guy is going to get just kind of close to it, so I might have to come back and trim that one too. But after we got it trimmed, we went back, and each of these drag wires has two nuts. That's just jam nuts there, so they kind of tighten against one another. And you're supposed to Loctite those, so we loosened just the outer one to keep the tension the same, put some red Loctite on the threads, and then tightened it back in and gave it just a tiny little snug with a wrench. It's hard to do too much because the drag wire will actually just spin. But just a little tightening, and that way it's, tightened up against its buddy there and Loctited and isn't going to go anywhere. We also put some torque seal on so that we could tell which ones we had done, and looking back at it, we would know that they were all done. The only exception to that is in bay 1, the drag wires out of the inboard end here, we did not do anything. We didn't Loctite or anything like that, and wrote the distance on the spar that they stick out past the block there, so we can see same kind of deal on this side. The reason for that is we actually will take off all these bolts, slide the whole drag wire out the other side for both of these drag wires in the first bay, and then install the fuel tanks. And then once the fuel tank gets installed, they actually kind of have a tube through the middle that the drag wires get passed back through and reinstalled. And then once you reinstall them, you obviously can't retension them, so you just tighten it back until the same amount is sticking out down here on the end, and that way you've got the same tension, everything stays nice and square. So that's why you don't Loctite those last couple, but you do everything else. After we got all those Loctited, we just went ahead and, per the manual, reinstalled this center aileron hanger. It's, again, just one AN3 bolt right there. But we Loctited that and torqued it down to its 25 inch-pounds, and then that guy was done. So from there, we put in this diagonal cross tube here, and you can kind of see, if I look at it through the end here, where that bolt head is underneath it. And there's a little interference there, so you have to carve away the end a little bit. We played around some, and I had bought a carbide burr for aluminum, and we checked that in the die grinder, and it actually did a really nice job of taking that away and mostly smoothing it, kind of getting the coarse adjustments, and then a Dremel with a little sanding drum smoothed everything out in a little sandpaper to kind of take that final little edge off. So that did a really nice job. Then we fitted in, match drilled the holes. So to match drill, I just kind of started with the top over there, put in a short little AN3 bolt, drilled the bottom, put in the long AN3 bolt through both, and then came on this side, did the same thing. Removed the tube, deburred the holes and everything, and then reinstalled it with the final hardware. The manual tells you not to torque this, but online, well, first of all, the torque for an AN3 is only 20 to 25 inch-pounds. They tell you just to snug it, and that's really 20 to 25 inch-pounds is kind of about snug anyway. So I was looking on the forums, and it sounded like Mitch, who was the builder support person previously, had told someone that the factory tightens them to 28 to 30 inch-pounds. Per the FAA publications and the specs on AN3 bolts we found, it sounds like 40 is really the max, but 20 to 25 is the recommended value. Since the manual says not to torque these anyway, we just went to the 25. It's kind of less than it sounds like what they do at the factory, basically just the snug that it says in the manual, and it's a nice, the recommended value for the bolt, so felt like that should be pretty good. But with that, the diagonal cross tube was done, so we were done through, I think that's step 17 at that point. Next was step 18, which is this front bracket here, and I'll come around to show that. But this is the bracket that's going to hold the front pulley for the aileron cable, and you measure the distance out here from rib number 8 outboard to the edge of it. Clamp it in place, really make sure that this edge is nice and lined up with the edge of the spar, because you're drilling into the spar, don't want to nick something bad. Got it all clamped, really measured a whole bunch of times, made sure we were right, and then started drilling, hole, put in a cleco, hole, put in a cleco, hole, cleco. Once we had the 3 in, we took off the clamps, just let the clecos hold it, and drilled the last 2. Also, it's really hard to deburr the back of those holes because of kind of the channel in the spar cap here. You can kind of see where it's this thin little channel to get up in, and it's curved around the bottom. So it's really hard to get something up in there, but took some time and got the backs of the holes deburred nicely. Didn't pull the rivets yet because you can see on this one that's sitting there, it actually hits that curved over part at the bottom when you try to push it in all the way. And the head doesn't go all the way down to the surface of, with the rivet. We had that before with the machine tail ribs, and they pulled okay, but this is a significantly bigger gap, like twice the size gap. So we just want to set up like a test piece with some square aluminum tube and not let the rivet go in all the way, and sort of see what we get. If we can get it, if it pulls correctly the first time and it's no problem, we can kind of repeat that, or if we need some other technique to pull that rivet correctly. But we figured rather than having to drill out, or the possibility of drilling out rivets on our, on a nice spar and on the real plane, let's test it and figure it out there first. So hopefully it all goes easily, and these will just be 5 that we can just pop right through, pull all of them in a couple minutes and be done. But that's why those aren't pulled yet. That'd be step 18. Just not quite done. Next we would have, after that, the rear spar reinforcement and the rear pulley bracket. So the rear spar reinforcement I actually have pulled apart already, and it's right here. So there's a whole bunch of holes in this, and you have to line it up on that rear spar cap and just match drill all the holes through here into the spar. So again, alignment is important, and you also notice down here I've got a couple holes labeled. That's because this is where the rear spar pulley, or the rear aileron pulley, excuse me, attaches. So 23 matches a hole that is on the pulley bracket itself, and you match drill those together through there. And then 24 and 22 are countersunk to sit under the pulley bracket, and then the pulley bracket has some more holes that you match drill through and rivet, the pulley bracket, the reinforcement cap here, and the spar all together. Just like 23, but a few more that are not kind of like those locator holes. So because the placement of hole 23 on that cap affects where the pulley bracket goes, you need to kind of place the pulley bracket on the reinforcement cap, position it side to side, kind of, they give you a little tolerance, and the idea is it sits just outside of rib number 6 here, the back right edge of it. But you have like a little bit back and forth that you can go, just a tiny amount, and you move back and forth with that pulley bracket set on the reinforcement cap, so that if you run a string through the pulley, it really nicely, perfectly runs down this center aileron hanger. That way your aileron cable lines up just really perfectly with the aileron itself, with the attachment point. So we needed the pulley bracket to work. I'll have a picture of it too, but here's the pulley bracket sitting back here, and you notice I've got it clamped down. Well, originally when I mounted the pulley in, before I tightened everything down, the pulley was not parallel to the sides of the bracket there. It looked cockeyed, and there was a large gap and everything like that, and it just really didn't look right. So we didn't think that was right, and wanted to make sure that the bracket was going to be right before we lined everything up based on it. Craig ended up going home, checking his, and his was kind of similar. So he figured out, we had talked about it here, but because we thought it was maybe messed up, didn't do anything with it. And then since his looked the same, he tried just tightening that bolt all the way down, and with one end clamped, it kind of pulled everything together and made it look good. I do still have it clamped because it no longer sits flat on the surface like this, but when we're installing it, if we have it clamped down so that it is sitting flat, and then match drill everything, rivet those holes where it's sitting flat, it'll sit flat. The rivets will ensure that, and that way it'll be installed correctly. You will notice that right now, it doesn't spin at all in there because of the bolt being tightened down. The nice thing here that we can do is when we're going to install it later, once it's kind of held in place like this with rivets, it'd be kind of the same since it's clamped right now. I could take out that bolt, shave off just a little bit of the edge of the pulley over there, kind of on that bearing surface that is up against the aluminum. Just sand off a little bit on either side, just enough to create enough clearance for that pulley to spin. And then there'll be no play, no, sliding back and forth of the pulley. It'll be a really nice fit in there, and it'll be able to spin. So that seems like kind of from what we read on the forums, like the little sanding of that seems like what most people do, or what you're supposed to do. And, that seems kind of like the right way to set that. So that was kind of confusing, definitely not clear from the manual, but kind of makes sense now that we've got it set up here. So the good news is the pulley bracket's ready to go next time, so we can kind of keep going on to that step. So we'll just kind of have to see. Hopefully Craig's part gets in soon, and we can get him to the same point, and then test the pulling for those front rivets, get them pulled, and then move on to that rear spar reinforcement cap and pulley bracket. Once once that spar reinforcement and the pulley bracket are done, then we get to start actually installing tail ribs and move on to kind of this back side of the wing and do tail ribs, the false spars, and kind of set the back. The center structure here will be mostly done at that point. So pretty exciting, really, really good progress this weekend, and has been really great to see it come together a lot faster.